Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. Today we have Armando Flores. However, we are having video difficulties with Armando, and unfortunately, he won't grace us with his presence. Armando, say hello.
Hello there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you
Excellent.
clearly.
You know what? And would you believe I even shaved for this meeting?
Oh,
Well, anyway.
yeah. So unfortunately, we won't be able to see him, but he definitely will give us plenty of information and all his that he's learned through with sports photography, all his years shooting sports. And so for now, let's give a few minutes for people to get settled. And feel free to chime in into the chat box and let us know where you're tuning in from. Armando and I actually are based in Los Angeles. So right now it's like 4:05 p.m. here, and it'll be great to see. Gosh, there's a lot of you online. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is exciting. Oh, oh my gosh, look at all these. Armando, do you see everybody chiming in here?
Oh, yeah.
Hi, hi Jim, hi Deidre. Let's see. Sorry for the delay. Yes, we were trying to figure out Armando's webcam. Sorry for that. Hello, Gail. Hi. And David, hello. Wisconsin, we have Wisconsin in the house, Illinois, St. Louis, Dallas, nice. Monroe Township, New Jersey, Wisconsin, hello. Oh, Gail says hello, Armando.
Oh, hi, Gail.
Tahoe, nice. Let's see if I recognize any names from last year. How has everybody, and I hope everybody had a great holiday break, and thank you for joining us again this year. Happy 2021. I got that wrong yesterday, if you believe that, Armando.
Oh, no. With everything that happened in 2020, you still called. Oh, boy.
I know, yeah, I know. So today I was like, wait, it's been in my head, like 2021, 2021. Oh gosh, let's see. I'm curious, is anybody from out of the country? Oh wow. Wow, we have Siva from India. Thank you for tuning in. Montana. Let's see who else? Maui, look at that. Hello. Now, does everybody have any audio video issues? If you do, let me type a note in here if you are. And sometimes I know with the audio or the video, you might not see the video. Sometimes when you log in, the windows will pop up so much, right? And they can get hidden behind one of the windows. So definitely look around for that. And hello from Florida. Hello, I'm actually originally from Florida. Wow, it looks like everybody's good to go. No video or audio issues so far. And so as far as questions go, we're going to keep it, pretty casual. If you have a question that, regarding an image or something, or just have a question for Armando during the talk, feel free to chime in. I'll try to get to as many as possible and forward that to Armando. If not, if it's something that's very detailed, then we'll try to keep that at the end for a quick Q&A as well. And let's see here. Yeah, looks like everybody is good to go. California in the house. Whoop, whoop, yes. Toronto, nice. Thank you for joining us today. All right, Armando, are you good to go? And I'm gonna.
I am. Just let me go ahead and share my screen.
Yeah, I'll need to give you the
okay.
The access here. You'll see a pop-up real soon. Right about now. Do you see that?
There it goes. Yeah, show my screen. All right, you see that?
Yes.
All right. Excellent. All right, let me go ahead and, hide this. Well, okay.
Yeah, so without further delay, I will hand it over to you, Armando, and I will see everybody at the end, or if you have questions, feel free to pop them up and I'll forward them throughout.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for attending this webinar. Um, like Janice said, I am from Los Angeles. Have lived here since, oh gosh, uh, 1968. There you go. Anyway, but what we're going to talk about today is let's do a little housekeeping and just give you a little a few details about our VIP club. So as a multiple Tamron lens owner, you can be part of the VIP program. Uh, you can find all of the details on our website, which is www.tamron-us.com. And basically, there are a lot of perks if you happen to own more than, I believe, is it what, 2 or 3 Tamron lenses? There's a lot of discounts and anyway, but you'll find all the details there. But today, what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about sports photography, uh, but more than sports photography is going to be how to freeze action, because a lot of photography that we do entails some type of movement, and we usually want to either freeze it or maybe perhaps want to show a little bit of that motion. So we're just going to call it that. Let's talk about freezing action. So once again, my name is Armando Flores. I'm a tech rep for Tamron USA, have been for a little over 6.5 years now. Before Tamron, I did do a little time with Sony. I was one of their tech slash sales reps for about 5 years. And before Sony, I actually worked for Nikon, and Janet did too, but we weren't there at the same time. But at Nikon, I was there for 22 years. And when I first started doing photography at Nikon, I got into sports photography. So I did practice sports photography at every level, even at the pro level, for about, I don't know, 17 to 20 years of the time that I was there. So I've shot just about every sport that you can, mention or think about. Football, basketball, baseball, all at the professional level. Boxing, I did boxing, in Las Vegas from about 2008 to 2007, I believe. No, 2007 roughly. So I did it for quite some time and enjoyed it. Always enjoy sports photography, but working with other companies has grown my horizon just a little bit. So I now do landscape and I do portraits and I do macro and a little bit of everything. But everything you learn in photography, you can use for just about any other type of photography. It's just simply knowing the settings. What settings do you need to do a particular shot that you're looking for? So anyway, let's go ahead and jump into camera modes. So manual mode is perfect and is perfectly fine when the lighting is constant or controlled. Okay, but when when you are using a fixed aperture lens, manual mode is great as well. But as you know, there are lenses out there that aren't a fixed aperture. In other words, as you zoom the lens, the aperture does change. That is called a variable aperture lens. We will talk about that in a second and tell you what the deal is with that. So in the manual mode, once again, if the lighting is constant or controlled, and you're using a fixed aperture lens, fixed aperture zoom lens. Let me specify that. All you need to do is, you know, set your exposure, and you just forget it. Forget about everything else until there's a change with the lighting. So anytime the light changes, you're going to have to start thinking about what you're going to change when we're talking about exposure. So anyway, if you are using a zoom lens that is a variable aperture lens, then you're going to have to contend with these 3 factors, as you know, the 3 factors that make up exposure. That is your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. So anytime you make a change to one of these 3 factors, you must make a change to one uh, or both in the opposite direction. So in order to maintain a perfect exposure, when the light level drops, you're going to have to change either the aperture or the shutter speed if you're concentrating on a specific uh, action shot. You need a very specific shutter speed to freeze the action. So in order to keep your exposure correct, if the light goes down or if you zoom your lens that has a variable setting, then you're going to have to change once again your aperture or your shutter speed. And
Hey,
like I said,
Armando.
yes,
Somebody mentioned, can you move your mouse cursor? Is in your images.
I'm sorry. It's invisible to me. I don't know where it is.
Um,
Is it gone?
yeah, it's off the image now, but I guess if
Okay.
you can move it up to the corner a little bit, just slide your
Yeah.
finger up a little
Yeah,
bit.
I did. So it's probably
Okay.
up and away, hopefully. Sorry about that,
Yeah,
folks.
no worries. It's better now.
Okay. All right. So we're going to cover a few topics during this webinar. And a few of the topics that we're going to cover are your understanding your shutter speed. Um, what shutter speed should you start with when you're photographing a moving subject? Other camera settings that are very helpful in freezing action or sports photography. And then, yes, you are going to run into some problems. So we're going to talk about solving a few of those. And of course, just like any type of photography, there is a lot of practice involved. In fact, I've been doing photography for many, many years, as you heard, but I'm still practicing. There's always something new to learn, believe it or not. So let's jump right into your shutter speed. Okay, so very simply put, shutter speed is simply the amount of time that you are allowing the light that comes through the lens to expose onto the sensor. That is basically it. However, what you're actually doing is you're controlling movement. You're either freezing or showing movement. That's what you're doing with your shutter speed. So when photographing a moving subject, it is important to know approximately how fast they might be traveling in order to select the right shutter speed. If your intent is to freeze that movement. So let me go ahead and give you and share with you a few starting points. So basically, if your subject is motionless, not moving, just standing still, like at a podium, for example, and you are hand holding the camera and the lens, then your shutter speed should be somewhere between a 60th to a 125th of a second. Most of us can handhold a camera and lens combination at those shutter speeds, so that is a good place to start. Of course, if your subject starts moving around a little bit, your shutter speed needs to increase. Hand gestures, walking around, you'll need a 125th to a 250th of a second. Now they're moving a little bit faster. They're jogging, maybe perhaps they're running. Running, you'll require anywhere between a 500 to a thousandth of a second. If your subject is moving faster than that, let's say they're cycling, then you're going to need anywhere between 1,000 and a 2,000th of a second. As you can see, the faster your subject moves, the faster your shutter speed needs to be in order for you to freeze that movement. Now, I did a quick test here. This shot that you're looking at, the cyclists are traveling at different speeds. The one on the line or closest to the lens is traveling at 10 miles an hour. The cyclist that's a little bit in front and slightly behind the first rider is traveling at 20 miles an hour. I selected a shutter speed of 1,000th of a second just to see what would happen. So the cyclist traveling at 10 miles an hour was nice and frozen. The one traveling at 20 miles an hour, I can see just a little bit of movement there. So, in other words, for that fast action, I should have been closer to 1,000th of a second. But anyway, that is just an example. You always want to select a shutter speed that is close or faster to what you think a shutter speed you might need. So in other words, the faster the better.
Hey, Armando.
Yes.
So Michael has a question regarding, do you auto ISO to keep your shutter speed and aperture constant in manual?
I'm sorry. What was that? What was I missed that the middle part?
Oh, he says, do you auto ISO to keep your shutter speed and
Ah,
aperture constant in manual?
that is a topic that we're going to talk about in a few slides. So I
Okay.
hopefully will answer that question then.
Okay.
Okay, so what camera mode should you try using when you're doing sports? There is a sports setting in your camera. Most cameras have a scene mode, and within that scene mode embedded are different types of shooting modes. There's a macro mode, a portrait mode, landscape, and there is a sports mode. However, that sports mode is a fully automated mode. You have zero control, and it doesn't even ask you what type of sports you're photographing. So I would say get away from this and let's choose something that will allow you a little more control. Now, believe it or not, I've been shooting for years, like I mentioned, again, but I do shoot in a semi-automated mode. I will shoot in shutter priority. For those of you that shoot Canon cameras, that is TV or time value. Anyway, shutter priority is a semi-automated mode. It allows you to select the desired shutter speed. Uh, in this mode, the camera then sets the aperture for you. However, you still have full control over all of the other settings. The reason I choose this mode is because it allows me a little more time to simply concentrate on the subject that I'm trying to photograph. So if I see that the subject all of a sudden moves a little bit faster, I can simply rotate my shutter, selection dial and select the faster shutter speed. So that I know that I'm, able to freeze that subject. But if I want to slow down the shutter speed, once again, simply rotate the dial in the opposite direction, and now I can show a little bit of movement. So it is for me very easy to change my settings without having to think, well, uh, because if you're in the manual mode, well, once again, if you selected a faster shutter speed, guess what? You're going to have to change your aperture. You're going to have to allow more light to come in to allow you for that faster shutter speed. If you select a slower shutter speed, then you're going to have to close your lens down. Um, or you're going to have to play with your ISO, either a higher ISO for a faster shutter speed or a lower ISO, for a slower shutter speed, or a combination of both changes on aperture and shutter speed. Now you can see how this can get really convoluted really quickly because you change your shutter speed 3 stops. Do you go 3 on the aperture, or do you do 1 aperture 2 ISO? Semi-auto for me works because now I only have to think about one thing. Um, Other camera settings that I also contend with when I'm, photographing a moving subject is my autofocus. I do select continuous autofocus because as the subject moves across the frame, the subject's distance to the camera changes. So the camera needs to continuously refocus to keep your subject in focus. And there is another setting when it comes to autofocus, and that is focus tracking. Now, most cameras nowadays have the capability of locking the focus on your subject and keeping it in focus as your subject moves around the frame. Once again, that is called focus tracking. Now, one thing I will tell you is that not all cameras autofocus systems are created equal. There are many, many different choices, and they all change from one camera model to the next and from one manufacturer to the other. Uh, I'll touch on this really quickly. There are two different types of autofocus sensors. These are designed as contrast detect and phase detect autofocus sensors. Um, Now, they do work a little bit different, and I won't get into that because that's a totally different topic. But another thing you need to know is the autofocus sensors on the autofocus chip are also aligned differently. Some are horizontal, some are vertical, some have sensors that go in both directions, and there is a reason for that. Now, Here are the autofocus choices for a Nikon D750. As you can see, you have a lot of choices here on how the autofocus system works. Let's go ahead and go through these really quickly. The one to the left and top, that is the wide area focus. So basically what the camera is doing is utilizing all of the autofocus points. Now, some of us would say, well, wow, that is great because I don't really have to, uh, you know, be right on the subject. The autofocus point will pick it up and so on and so forth. But the way this one works is that it usually will focus on the closest thing to the lens, which may not necessarily be your subject. So I don't like using wide area. Then there is a center zone autofocus, and it will use all of the autofocus points within the center. However, if your subject is very small in the viewfinder, it may not catch your subject. If you are doing, let's say, for example, a foot race, there may be 2 or 3 people coming right at you. Well, it may pick up the wrong person. So once again, I don't really like using that one. Now, every camera has what we, based on the position that the autofocus points are located and how they're arranged. These cameras have what we call cross type sensors. In other words, the autofocus sensors align both horizontally and vertically. So regardless of how you are holding your camera or what orientation, it is able to pick up the subject. So the cross type autofocus sensors will be the most accurate for you. Then you have another mode called the zone focusing mode. So you can select a smaller group of focusing points to the right, to the left, to the top, to the bottom, or in the center. This is ideal when you have a group of subjects coming at you, like I said, like that foot race, and you want to make sure that the guy in front is the one that the camera focuses in. This will once again be a little more ideal because it's more of a center or a spot or a smaller group. And then once again, you do have an autofocus point that is one single autofocus point. So from all of the autofocus point that your camera has available, you can move it around and select one of those. This is going to be the most accurate, especially if you are using one of the cross type autofocusing points. Anyway, so this example, birds coming
Yeah,
in.
Armando,
Yes,
should we tackle some questions while we're
yes. Yeah, we
here?
can.
Okay. So it's a lot of questions about, so for, unless you're going to cover it, I'm not sure, like particular, like specific, like, gymnastics or flying birds, like what speed, what shutter speed to use in those instances, or will you be covering that in a couple slides?
Oh, we can cover it as we go along, or let's tackle this one right now. Birds.
Yeah.
Birds in flight. All right, birds in flight. We're going to need a shutter speed of a minimum of a 500th of a second. Now, as you know, as they're coming in and they're flapping the wings a little bit faster because they're coming in for a landing, if you want to freeze the tips of the wings of the birds, you're going to need a shutter speed that's closer to 1,000th of a second. But sometimes what we want to do is show a little bit of movement or motion in those tips of the wings. So a 500th may be better. So it once again, it just simply depends on what you want to show or convey. If you want to show a little bit more movement in the wings as the bird is coming in and you're tracking it and you're following it, a 250th will give you a little more of that movement. Once again, it just simply depends on how fast that bird is coming in and how much motion you want to show on that bird. But as you can see with this image, we selected a zone autofocus, which gives us a total of 9 autofocus points on the camera, and the camera simply selects one and focuses, uses that one autofocus point to focus on that bird for us. So there is another camera setting that I like to use, and that is continuous shooting. So continuous shooting is very important because what you want to do is, you want to capture as much of the motion that's happening as you possibly can. So in order to do that, you need a camera with a fast frame rate. You're gonna need a camera with a fast frame rate because in that case you're gonna have more chances that you're gonna capture the subject, at peak action. So in order to get the right shot, we need, you know, uh, cameras that give you a pretty good frame rate, and we will touch on those in a second. So for most sports, you will need a camera that fires at around 6 frames per second. Once again, that is the bare minimum in my opinion for most sports. Um, because some cameras, especially the entry level cameras, they will fire at somewhere between 3 and 5 frames per second, and that will be at the bottom end. Mid level cameras will do somewhere between 5 and 8 frames per second. Now, while your pro and prosumer cameras will fire anywhere between 10 and over 20 frames per second. So that is what it looks like at 6 frames per second. So as you can imagine, the faster your camera fires, the more chances you're going to have to capture your subject in peak action or get that frame that you think, okay, this is perfect. Um, had I shot this with a camera that did 20 frames per second, then obviously I would have had a multiple of choices to select from. So let's go ahead and talk about that subject, that question that someone was just asking about, and that is auto ISO. So auto ISO is a good mode to use, especially when you are using a semi-automated mode. So in the case of shutter priority, the camera is controlling the aperture. Okay, and if you allow the camera auto ISO as a setting, then the camera can select the ISO for you as well. In some cases, what happens is that your subject may transition from a dark area or a dark background to a bright area or a bright background. So if that happens, um, and your camera is controlling the aperture, and your lens, as you know, has a fixed it has a fixed aperture. In other words, it cannot open any more than it already has. All right, shutter priority, cameras controlling the aperture. You have a lens that is, let's say, a 70 to 210 at f4. You've selected a shutter speed of 1,000th of a second. The camera is already at f4, the maximum aperture of the lens. All of a sudden, your subject starts moving faster, and you need to select a 2,000th of a second. Well, the camera can't open up the lens any longer, but with auto ISO, you do give it the ability to change the ISO for you from whatever you had it set to something a little higher to enable you a proper exposure. And that is where that auto ISO comes in and plays very well. However, what you need to do is you need to set the parameters of auto ISO. In other words, if you simply just set auto ISO, the camera can select from the minimum ISO, which is usually about 100, all the way to the maximum, which could be to over 150,000 ISO. And believe me, most cameras do not do a good job at those very high ISO. That Nikon D750 that I just mentioned, has an ISO range that goes up to 12,800. So from 100 to 12,800. However, what I like to do every time I get a new camera is I like to do an ISO test. I'd like to see how the camera reacts in the higher ISOs so that I know what my tolerance for noise is with that particular camera body. I take the camera, set it up on a tripod, put a scene that has a bright area, a midtone, and then a shadow area. That's where you're going to see the noise. And the noise are little dots, RGB dots, red, green, blue dots in the shadow areas, and that's called noise. Back in the film days, we used to call it green. This is actually a frame from a film. This was 1600 ISO film pushed to 3200. And as you can see, the grain structure does break up a little bit. Same thing happens with your digital camera. You get more noise. Now, most cameras do a very good job up to about 800, and then that's where they start falling apart. So what I do is I'll set up my camera, that scene that I told you about. I'll set my ISO to 800, take the next shot, double the number, 16, 32, 64, and in the case of the Nikon D750, 12,800. I make prints, bring them back, take a look at them, and then I pick out that ISO number that I find is too noisy for me. On that camera, I found that I will never use anything above 3200 ISO. So there you go. Now you've got your parameters for auto ISO. I will go into the setting and tell the camera never go above this ISO number. So from 100 to 3200, that's a pretty good range. Um, so you will find this probably helpful if you do start playing with that auto ISO setting. So there could be some problems when we're photographing some subjects. I've ran into quite a few, during the years, and it will vary from one camera to the other, one manufacturer to the other, because different camera models, once again, have different autofocus sensors, different metering systems, so the problems can be all over the place. This particular time, I was actually doing an event in Colorado. I was at a birding event for Tamron, and I had 3 trunks of lenses, and I loaned out every lens that I had. I was left with only one that nobody wanted. It was a macro lens. It was a 180 millimeter f3.5 macro lens. Let me tell you, not the fastest focusing lens of the bunch, a very old design, so on and so forth. Mounted that with a lens adapter on a Sony camera. So there you go. Now you can see the problem. Autofocus is not going to happen. So I went out there and I took pictures anyway. So what I did is I did a zone or a pre-focus. I figured out the trajectory that the bird was going to take on his first pass. I followed the bird and said, okay, it's going to be, anywhere from 20 feet to about 30 feet in front of me. So I set my exposure. I wanted to make sure I would have enough depth of field to make sure that the bird came within that path, it would be in focus. So I chose an aperture of f11. I needed a fast shutter speed to freeze the bird, so I chose a 500th of a second. This in turn led me to select an ISO of 800 to give me that exposure combination. So the bird did another pass, followed the bird. Once it got to that zone that I had pre-focused in, fired the button. I probably got about 4 shots, and this was in the best position I felt, but they were all tack sharp. So when you are photographing a moving subject and it's going to repeat the motion, come back to the same spot, whatever, you can wait till the subject gets there, pre-focus, and simply wait until the action happens and press the button. When I do that, I am usually photographing with both eyes open. One through the viewfinder so I can see it when it comes into frame, and the other eye is following the subject as it approaches. So then I can go ahead and just press the trigger. So sometimes we may be in a situation where we're outlensed. In other words, the subject's too far. We can't get close enough. So how do we solve that problem? Well, yes, you can take your picture with whatever you got and, bring it back into your computer and then crop the heck out of it and then frame it the way you want. The problem with that is that what you're doing when you're cropping is you're throwing away data. So you better have a camera that has enough pixels to enable you to do that. Let's say, for example, I take a picture with a 24 megapixel camera, and my subject is so small that I'm going to have to crop 75% out, and my subject will be left with 25% of my original image. If I started with a 24 megapixel camera, I'm down to 6 megapixels. Is that a bad thing? Well, it really depends on what you're going to do with that image. And the sad thing or the bad thing is that we may not know what we want to do with that image a year down the road. Now, if all I'm going to do is do presentations on a laptop that has a resolution screen of 1920 by 1080 or an HD screen, if you multiply 1920 by 1080, you get about 2.2 million. So all I need is a image with a shot from a camera with 2 million pixels to be able to show an image full resolution. However, things do progress in advance. Technology gets a lot better. A few years ago, they came out with 4K screens. Guess what? Now you're going to need 4 times the resolution. A 4K screen requires 8 megapixels. 2 years ago, they came out with TVs or screens that are 8K. And guess what? Now you need 36 million pixels. So you can see where I'm getting. It's always better to shoot your image cropped as much as possible in the viewfinder before you press the button. So you're outgunned, you're in a situation like this. But let's say, for example, you brought with you a crop sensor camera. Remember, a crop sensor camera has a smaller sensor that is, if it's an APS-C size sensor, it's about 2.4 times smaller than full frame. So you do get what we call a magnification. The angle of view, the apparent angle of view of the lens does get narrower or shorter, so it magnifies it for you. If it's a Nikon, a Sony, a Fuji, a Pentax, or a Leica, and you have an APS-C size sensor DSLR camera, your crop factor is 1.5. So any lens you mount on that camera, you multiply it by 1.5. So for example, if I were shooting that image with the 70 to 200 2.8 and a D500, which is a crop sensor camera that gives me a 10 frames per second, guess what? I now have a 105 to 300 millimeter at 2.8. So that's a win-win. It's still a 24 megapixel camera. It has the same resolution as a full frame. The only difference between the cameras is, yes, the sensor is smaller, so therefore the pixels themselves are smaller. And that is where you might run into trouble if you go up to the higher ISOs, because a smaller pixel doesn't capture as much light as a larger pixel. So at the higher ISO levels, you could run into a little bit of trouble. What you can do also is, obviously, you can use a longer lens if you have one, or you can use adapters like teleconverters. If you use a teleconverter in conjunction with a crop sensor camera, let's say, for example, use a teleconverter that has a 1.4 magnification, guess what? Now you can take that lens, multiply it by 1.5, and then multiply all that by 1.4. So if we mount a 150 to 600 on our crop sensor camera with a 1.5 crop factor, we have an angle of view of 900 millimeters when fully extended. We throw a 1.4 converter, and guess what? We're over 1,000 millimeters. I believe it's 1,280 or something like that. Forget the exact math, but you can multiply it, and you can figure that one out. If you have an APS-C size sensor Canon, the crop factor is 1.6, so your math just got a little bit more difficult. So let's go ahead and move on, and let's say that we are photographing a subject, but we want to show a little bit of movement or motion. What we want to do is we want to create a pan. So what I usually do, and my Nikon cameras allow me to do this, not all cameras do. I set my camera to shutter priority. Okay, I will then set my autofocus to continuous autofocus with focus tracking, and I will select continuous shooting as well. I acquire focus on my subject ahead of time, knowing that I'm going to press the button at a very specific point. Follow my subject, and as my subject approaches the scene or the spot where I'm going to press the button, I fire off the camera. And in shutter priority, I've got that shutter dial on my thumb, and I can rotate the shutter dial as I'm taking pictures. And what I'm doing is I'm slowing down the shutter speed. So if I'm not sure how much movement I want to show or convey, once again, I start about 3 to 4 shutter speeds slower than the recommended. For example, for the runner right here, 500 of a second was more than enough to freeze him, even though he's traveling at 10 miles an hour. But I wanted to show a little bit of movement, so I set my shutter speed to 4 stops below. So I went from a 500 to a 250, a 125, a 60th of a second, a 30th of a second. That is 4 stops. I started at a 30th of a second, pressed the button, and rotated my shutter speed. So I shot 5 pictures, right? 30th, a 15th, an eighth, and so on and so forth, because I was slowing down the shutter speed as the subject went across the scene. Okay, so once again, acquire focus way in advance. Sometimes I will do this once again with both eyes open so that I can see that, okay, they're coming, I've got them in frame, and I'm simply following to make sure that they are framed as I want them to be. So, you can simply go ahead and start taking pictures. This one, same technique. Press the button, rotate the shutter speed dial. This was captured at a 60th of a second. So, shows enough movement. What happens if I press the button and rotate the shutter speed dial? That's a 30th of a second. And this one is at a 15th of a second. As you can see, it begins to get a little tougher to keep your subject in the frame, because if you don't keep it in the frame, then you're going to get some ghosting images. There is a little bit of blur, and sometimes the subject or part of the subject could be traveling or moving too quickly, and you're going to get parts of the subject disappear. The cyclist on the back, you can see his feet. They're rotating much faster than the actual bike is. So his left foot has pretty much disappeared from the frame. And that is a problem that you can have. But it's called photography and we do call it art. So if that's what you want to practice, then go ahead and play with this technique. And uh, remember, no 2 frames are ever going to be the same. That is the beauty about this technique, because everything is different. And I do recommend that when you go out and do some sports photography, do a little bit of homework. If you practice that sport, you know exactly where to be and when to be at what particular point. If you've never photographed that sport, I do suggest you go and watch that sport being practiced a couple times. Take your camera, sure, and just kind of play with it. But if you're familiar with the sport, you're going to get a better idea of what to expect and when. Also, knowing your sport is going to give you a better idea of what lens to use from the vantage point that you might be at. And if you get there early, especially if you haven't shot from that location or that venue, um, you can then explore where you may want to position yourself, uh, and you can choose a better background. You can look at the lighting and see, where is the best lighting, or where is the dark area, where is the brightest area, or where are the hot spots or the shadows, as we call it. You can also determine what your exposure is going to be. Know your venue. Very important. Whenever I photograph sports, it was usually at the same venue or a selection of venues that I was very familiar or comfortable with. It was either at the Coliseum or at the Anaheim Stadium. So at certain time of the year and certain time of the day, depending on when the game started, you pretty much knew what the lighting was going to be. If you're photographing In an arena, then the lighting is controlled. So you're pretty sure to know that the lighting is going to be the same, every time you go to this particular place. If it's a new gymnasium or a new arena, once again, you do want to get there a little bit earlier because the arena or the place that you're photographing is going to influence your lens selection. Some arenas may be darker than others, so that means you're going to need either a faster lens, and by fast I mean a lens that has a larger, aperture, more light gathering capability. Sometimes we may be in positions where you're in a poorly lit gymnasium, and your lens choices are once again are going to be predetermined. If you're photographing indoor sports, and you're photographing, for example, in a gymnasium, you're doing basketball. Usually, if you have free reign of the court, you can move around and position yourself wherever you want. Then, if you're shooting near to the near the basket that's closest to you from maybe perhaps one of the corners, you can get away with a 24-70 millimeter lens from that vantage point. Now, if the action starts moving midcourt or cross court to the other basket, then obviously in basketball you can't move around that quickly because the action happens just way too fast. You're going to have to switch lenses. What I do in most of these situations, I've got two cameras. One camera has a short to medium zoom where I can shoot at the basket closest to me, like a 24-70. And once they start moving cross court, I will switch cameras, grab the other camera that perhaps has a 24-70 millimeter lens. And now I can capture the shots as they're moving away from me or as they're going to the other basket. And yes, sometimes I will grab a camera that's a crop sensor camera to give me that advantage of a more telephoto lens than I actually have. So once again, a 70 to 200 becomes a 105 to 300 at 2.8, and when they're at the other basket, it's perfect for that. If you're shooting a volleyball, 70 to 200 is excellent for that. And I choose 2.8 because a lot of these situations, these arenas are poorly lit, so you're going to need a lens that captures a little more light. Gymnastics, depending on the type of gymnastics that you're going to be photographing, what apparatus are they performing on? If they're on the floor, obviously they've got to run from one end to the other, and they usually take advantage of that full area, and that's a pretty large area. You're going to need a longer lens. You're going to be closer to 200 millimeters if you're using a 70 to 200. So, once again, it depends on where you're going to be positioned. Swimming, uh, is the person in the lane closest to you, or are they at the furthest lane? Once again, will determine what lenses you're going to need. Usually a 70 to 200 for indoor sports, it's probably going to get you just about everything that you're going to be looking for. And then, of course, you've got your outdoor sports. Now, when you're photographing outdoors, you will have a lot more flexibility when it comes to lens choices. Um, Especially if you can position yourself anywhere. If you are not relegated to a very specific spot, then you can shoot with just about any lens that you want. But some sports, unfortunately, require you to be at a very specific spot. And sometimes you cannot move from that particular spot. This particular shot, shooting from the dugout, so you're stuck within that little pit, and in this case, I only had a pretty much a clear view of home plate and first base. I chose a 70 to 200 on a crop sensor camera. Once again, that gave me a 300 at 2.8. And when I was photographing the batter, it gave me a good, good flexibility. I still had a little room to crop. When they came and they were running to first base, then obviously I had to pull back just a little bit. If I were shooting second base, from that particular position. They're a little bit further away. And of course, third base was way too far. You're going to need longer lens for that, something closer to a 400 millimeter. Once again, there are different choices for different types of venues. My suggestion is, go to the location, look at it, see how close you can get, um, see where your best vantage points are. Look at where the sun is rising, where the sun's setting, and where the best lighting position is as well. This is the skate park in Venice Beach. You've got many different choices. I mean, you can walk on the deck and you can shoot from just about anywhere you want. So once again, in a position like this, whatever lens you have is probably going to be a good choice. But once again, I do recommend that you get out there and you shoot. Every time you go out there, you're going to learn something new that maybe perhaps you hadn't encountered before, and you're going to do a better job the next time you go out. So I do recommend that you have a game plan. Where am I going? What time of day? Where is the sun going to be? So on and so forth. What lenses am I going to take? What events am I going to photograph? And is that lens, good enough for what I'm, you know, want to do? So once again, get there early, do a little recon, figure out where the best position is going to be. I got there a little early for this particular track meet, and I saw that the girls 4x100 was having a little bit of trouble with the handoff as they were practicing, and I saw that the problem was in the handoff between the third leg and fourth. So I positioned myself in that spot. I had a 70 to 300. I knew that this was long enough for me to get the shot that I wanted. And the lighting was good because it was to their back. So everything worked out. So they went ahead and, they kept going. Once again, choosing the right equipment and the best lighting, continuous autofocus, continuous shooting, focus tracking. Any questions?
Yes, Armando, you have tons of questions and we need to get to them.
Okay.
Do you have your social handles up so that people, if we don't get to all of them, that they can contact you directly?
Um,
Do you have
I
your,
did. I didn't put that screen up.
oh, you
Shame on
did
me.
it? Yeah, I thought you
But
normally do.
I always do. But I will get it while you were talking.
Okay.
So let me
All
go
right.
ahead and
No
it's
worries.
here, and I'll get the screen that has it. Go ahead.
Okay, so we're gonna do some rapid fire ones. So that these are like just basic questions. So I'm just shoot them out real quick and just answer them briefly. These are just mainly questions about certain how you shoot and stuff like do you back focus?
For some sports, I do back focus, especially the sports where your subject is very erratic, moving in various directions and not continuous. When that happens, I do use back focus. For example, if I'm shooting boxing, they're moving
Oh,
around the ring,
actually,
and yeah,
I'm sorry. I think I read it wrong. They asked, do you use the back button focus?
yes, yeah, back button focus. That's what I was getting at. So
Oh,
for
okay.
for boxing, basically the subjects are moving all around the ring, back and forth, right, left. So what I want to do is I want to use back button focus so that I know that the subject is in focus when I decide to press the button. So it works well in my opinion, and the way I shoot, it works well for certain sports for me, but not all sports. If I'm
Okay,
doing,
what?
for
Oh,
example, if I'm doing a skateboarder who's doing a particular trick and he keeps doing that trick, then I will select one autofocus point, follow him. When he gets to it, press the button, fire off. So no back button focus there.
Great. And quickly, what shutter speed would you suggest for surfing?
Surfing, they're not moving that fast. I would say 500th of a second is probably going to be fast enough for just about everything that they do.
Okay. And so when light is too low, autofocus will interrupt. Wait, so what happens? Oh, so what happens when light is too low? Autofocus will interrupt shutter release. Is that a
Okay.
question?
Well, they may be talking about low light and autofocus performance is what I'm thinking. And yes,
Okay.
that is definitely a problem, but there's so many variables involved that we need to break them down specifically. What lens you're using? What motors does that lens in particular have? Is it a lens with a large aperture, and does that lens have very fast autofocusing motors? Second thing you need to look at is the camera that you're using. How many autofocus points or sensors that does that camera have? Um, and what type of autofocus sensors does that camera have is also very important. The older cameras had what we called um, f/2.8 sensors. In other words, they needed the light capabilities of a lens with a maximum aperture of 2.8. So they needed a lot of light for them to simply work. As cameras got better, technology got better, then we moved on to f/5.6 sensors. So now all you need is a lens that has a maximum aperture f/5.6 in order for it to work. Well, we're now at f/8 sensors. So you need even less light for those autofocus sensors to work. Again, this is a loaded question because it really depends on what camera you have and what autofocus sensors that particular camera has that will determine your autofocus performance in low light.
Okay. What meter mode do you use? Evaluative, partial, spot, or center weight?
That will really depend on the venue where I'm photographing. If I'm photographing, let's say, for example, at a gymnasium, and the only real light source is right on the court, then your matrix metering will not work. Your evaluative meter will not work because it's reading the dark areas behind your subject as well as the light areas in front. So you may want to do a meter reading under the basket because naturally that's probably where we're going to photograph, and then set your exposure for that particular case manually. If you set your exposure manually, whatever autofocus uh, autofocus or whatever metering mode you're using will be irrelevant, because when you set your exposure manual, that is the way it's going to be set. It is very difficult to photograph subjects that once again transition from a light area to a dark area. In that case, if you want to use a semi-automated mode like shutter priority or aperture priority, you may want to use a center weighted metering mode. Now, those do vary from one camera model to the next on the amount of weighting that they offer and the size of that center target. It could be a 12 millimeter spot, it could be a 10 millimeter spot, it could be a 14 millimeter spot. Some cameras do give you the ability to change the size of that metering target, and they give you the ability to change the amount of weighting that center weighted metering does. It could go from 65 to 80%. So whatever that center circle, 65 or 80% of the metering is going to be happening there. In a situation like I explained, that basketball court, center weighted is probably going to be a better choice.
Okay. Let's see. Quickly, I have so many, Armando. So let's keep it. Let's see. So for which storage card speed do you recommend? Are you shooting in RAW?
I personally always shoot in RAW, and the speed of the card really depends on how fast the camera can write information onto the card. And this, you're going to have to do a little research on your particular camera. Because if you buy a very fast card and your camera can only record at a certain speed, you're spending too much money on a fast card when your camera can't take advantage of it. However, it does help you when you download your images to the computer. So always get the fastest card that your camera will accept minimum. So
Okay, which,
again, it's
oh,
one of those questions that it depends on the camera that you have, what card you should get. You know what I mean?
great.
It's not a one fixes, one answer for all the cameras.
Okay. Which focus setting is used when people or objects moving in different speeds, similar to your bicycle photo you referenced?
Oh, okay. Focus, continuous autofocus, focus tracking, and in that case, I used a zone focus or a group. I used the
Hmm.
group to the left because I was more concerned about the cyclist going faster than I was the cyclist going slower. I knew I could capture it because he was only doing 10 miles an hour, the other one was doing 20, so it was a little more difficult to keep them in focus. So a group of autofocus or zone focus.
Does the firing of frames per second depend on the type of storage chip you're using?
No, the firing rate of the camera is determined by the camera. The amount of frames that you can store onto the camera depends on various things. The right speed of the camera plus the buffer size, because as you take a picture, it goes into a folder that folder downloads it to the card. And that folder only has a certain amount of shots. That's called the buffer. So it really depends on the camera that you have. Some may only have a 10-shot buffer in RAW. Some of them may have, a 100-shot buffer. So in your instruction book of your camera, you should be able to get that information, or simply Google it, and you should be able to see what is the buffer size in RAW for your particular camera body.
Great. Do you use any type of denoise editing program for your high ISOs?
I try once again not to shoot beyond the ISO that I felt was too noisy for me, and I pretty much stick to that, believe it or not. On that, like I said, that D750 that I mentioned that I did the test on, I never shoot at about 30 above 3200. If and the noise is quite acceptable at 3200. Sometimes I will go into Photoshop and do a little, noise reduction, but not usually.
Got it. And do you calibrate the lenses before shooting, and how long should one go before calibrating so you don't miss your shot?
It is a good idea to test and see if your camera and lens are communicating properly. And when the camera tells the lens to stop and focus here, the lens knows where here is. That is the way the whole mechanism works with autofocus. So yeah, I will focus at a target at a distance, at a very specific distance, and see if it's focusing properly. If it is, I don't worry about it. Let me tell you, calibrating a lens for focusing, it is a lot more time consuming than you might think,
Yeah.
because you're going to there are tutorials online that you can look at, and you can see what I mean by this, because it could take you quite a bit of time to to achieve this. But yes, test your lens and see if it's within that realm of acceptability. If it isn't, then I would say yes, do a tutorial. If you calibrate it, you should only have to calibrate it once. The camera will have that in memory, so anytime you mount that lens onto that camera, it knows how to or where when it to how to focus properly, basically. It's just the information going from camera to lens telling the lens stop here. So if here is in front of the subject, that is front focus. If here is behind the subject, it is back focusing. But once you do your calibration, you tell it, well, no, you got to move here to the center. Then the camera does that setting for that lens all the time. So yeah.
You mentioned using teleconverters earlier. Do teleconverters let in less light?
Yes, once again, teleconverters, there is glass inside the teleconverter, so it is a lens. You're mounting a lens in between the camera and the lens that you're going to mount it on. So you do lose light. A 1.4 converter will lose one stop of light. So your f2.8 lens is now an f4 lens, and so on and so forth. Um, but you do get that gain of that magnification. And once again, teleconverters are very temperamental. Um, Nikon converters don't like to work on anything but Nikon lenses. Uh, so be very aware. Don't go out and buy a converter for the lens. Make sure that you buy the right converter for the right lens. Canons are a little more lenient, but Nikons no. Nikon lens and a Nikon converter, so on and so forth.
And let's see, a quick monopod or tripod, is there an advantage or disadvantage to either?
Monopod is a lot more mobile.
Hmm.
Uh, so you're shooting moving subjects. Your shutter speed has to be a very specific shutter speed, usually faster than 250. So a monopod is probably going to be your best bet because you then are more mobile than a tripod. Tripod, you got to set it up, take it apart. The legs could get in the way. Subjects are moving back and forth. Monopod allows you to move in, move out, and move out of the way quicker. So I always use a monopod when I'm doing sports.
What is the best advice you can give to interested photographers trying to work with this genre? Oh, sorry, of photography during the pandemic. This has had an effect, obviously, on
Oh,
event and wedding
yes.
photographers. Yeah.
Um, I'd say yes. There are a lot fewer sports happening than ever, but I still find the time to go out and freeze action. Doesn't have to necessarily be a sport. I can just freeze action. I go to Venice Beach and there are people doing all sorts of activities. They're still playing volleyball, so you can shoot
Yeah.
that. You can shoot that
I
from a distance.
yeah, I remember that day that we went. It was fun shooting the skaters.
They're always skating. There's a skate park. You can practice and hone your skills on shutter speeds, and it's one thing I will mention is that sports is always about the timing, getting that timing right. In other words, pressing the button at the right time. uh, and different sports obviously require different timing. Go out there and play and practice and just shoot. You will see that the next time you go out, your timing is going to be better. Your take home shots are going to be more, and your misses are going to be fewer. Again, this is all about practice. Find a skate park. There are runners, uh, there are cyclists on the bike strand. I mean, there's so many things you can do, and that entail freezing a subject.
When shooting sports, do you turn on the VC? He usually shoots hockey games and lighting is always poor in hockey rinks.
Um, you know what? My VC on my camera, excuse me, on my lens is turned on all the time. The only time I really turn it off is when I mount it on a tripod, and if I'm doing shots with shutter speed slower than a quarter of a second. So I always leave it on. Now, some Tamron lenses have different modes. There's a mode 1, which is the normal mode. In other words, you see the compensation happening in the viewfinder. There's the number 2 mode, and that is for sports when you're panning. If you're following a subject, what the VC mode is doing in the number 2 mode, it's correcting for the movement that you're not creating. If you're moving horizontal, it's going to correct for the vertical and diagonal movement, but not the horizontal. And when you're following a subject, so any type of moving subject, birds, whatever that you're moving, number 2 mode is the best. I always use the number 3 mode. You don't see it in the viewfinder, so you don't know, you don't see it working. However, because it doesn't take that time to show you what it's doing, it's going to be faster and better. So simply trust it. I leave it in the number 3 mode, except if I'm panning.
Got it. And I guess, I mean, again, with the whole frame rates and stuff, someone's asking, what is your favorite frame rate, or maybe your go-to that you have it set usually when you start out on most sports?
No, actually, no. I do change the frame rate. Most cameras allow you to go high, mid, or low. So the high is going to be the fastest that the camera can shoot. I shoot with a Sony and a Nikon, mirrorless and DSLR. I've got a total of 5, 6 different cameras. So each one is a little bit different. If I'm using the Sony mirrorless that shoots at 10 frames per second for a skateboarder that's doing a trick, it's too fast. I'll slow it down. I'll maybe use the mid mode that goes up to about 5 or 6 frames per second. So yeah, it depends on what I'm trying to shoot. If I'm shooting baseball and I'm concentrating on the batter and I want to capture the bat hitting the ball, then I'm going to choose the fastest frame rate possible, because that swing happens very, very fast. In a case like that, 10 frames per second or more is what you're going to need. So
And what about white balance? Do you preset your white balance or do you use auto?
I would say that 80% of the time, if I'm outdoors, I'm going to use an auto white balance. It's usually pretty good and it does a pretty good job. Of course, there are times when it can be fooled, but if I'm inside an arena, I will set it manually because it can be fooled. You may have different light sources. It may be more intense in one area than the other. There may be light streaming from a doorway or a bank of windows. You just never know. So in an arena, I tend to set it myself manually.
A question from Lawrence. Please comment on the use of circular versus linear polarizers outdoors.
Okay. So circular polarizing filters were created for autofocus systems. So if you're using an autofocus camera, you need a circular polarizing filter. The way the focusing mechanisms work, especially in DSLRs that use contrast detect, uh, it needs a circular polarizing filter because a linear polarizing filter will fool the autofocus system and it will not work. So most of us nowadays have DSLRs, of course, with autofocus systems. So circular polarizer is what you're going to need. And for sports, I seldom use a polarizing filter. Unless I want to create a very specific effect. So I'm not concentrating on the sport. I'm mostly concentrating on the aesthetics of the image. A lot of clouds over the arena. Maybe I want to get the sky really blue, the clouds really white. Maybe there's a reflection on something and I want to take that reflection out. Circular polarizer for that.
Perfect. Do you use stabilizer mode? I think
That's the
yeah,
VC mode.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's our yes, yes. So he does, yes.
Yes.
A quick, do you golf?
I used to golf a lot with when I was working at Nikon, because the president of Nikon would
Mm,
come to the US and he would require all of
yes.
the sales and tech reps to go out and play golf with him. So I used to.
Yeah, that was a fun one. Okay, so I guess we're going in line with that for golf swings. How would you shoot a golf swing?
Oh, okay. So if you want to freeze that golf swing when they're coming, you know, down on the swing to make contact with the ball, you probably, if you want to freeze that, you're going to need 2,000th or a 4,000th of a second to be able to freeze that. If you want to freeze the contact from the club on the ball and not get a goose egg when it misshapes it, then you better go to an 8,000th of a second.
I think he's kind of referring to, which I guess we can touch base because someone else is asking kind of a similar question, like how do you compensate, I guess, for like let's say the putting green, or another one's asking for ice and snow. I know there's two different ones, but I think they're talking about compensating
The
for
exposure?
the.
Are we
Mhm.
talking company? Okay, so uh, if you're photographing a golf match, um, if you meter off the freshly mowed grass, the dark part, not the shiny part, because if you move around the grass, you can see, okay, this is shiny and this is non-reflective. Meter off that non-reflective, that is about 18% gray, which is what most camera meters work off of. You meter off of that, that is going to be your exposure. Set it in manual and forget it. That is usually the way I work. Now, if I'm photographing in the snow, then obviously the snow is reflecting a lot more light, causing your meters to go haywire. I start at 2 stops uh, overexposed from whatever the camera is reading. So in other words, if I'm shooting a snowboarder and I'm shooting shutter priority, I'm using an evaluative meter. I basically go to my exposure compensation button or lever on top and go +2 and start from there. See how it looks. If I'm close, good. If not, I'll probably increase it to 2 1/3 or 2 2/3 or maybe even 3. It depends.
Great. Let's see. Quick question. Have you ever shot for like baseball cards?
No, no, I've never had that opportunity. I have shot baseball. I did shoot some baseball games way in the, a long time ago for AP and Reuters, but never for a card company.
And how would you get access to events if you're not working for a press outlet? She likes to take swimming pictures, but need to get on deck somehow.
Okay, so what you need to do is you need to be very friendly and make some friends. Um,
Yeah.
if you're photographing, for example, a swim meet for a college, get to know the coach, get to know the assistant coach, and tell them that you're doing this, doing that, and any images that you get, maybe perhaps they can use either for free or at a discount or whatever. Um, Most of my access when I photograph sports professionally came from knowing someone somewhere. Because if you try to do it on your own, you'll find that the doors close very quickly. So figure out where the event takes place, and maybe perhaps somebody at the venue. I knew the photographer for the Lakers, the team photographer. So anytime I wanted to go to a Laker game and photograph, I just gave him a call. I knew the Raiders team photographer. I knew the um, 49ers team photographer, the Rams team photographer. So, being at the right place at the right time gave me access to people that allowed me to photograph just about anywhere.
Yes, it's kind of like when we shot a concert and you
Yes,
happen to
exactly.
know me and I happen to know somebody.
Exactly. It's knowing the right person to help you with the access.
Yes, a couple questions regarding Supercross or motorcycles, for tips for shooting Supercross and stuff, motocross.
Just like bicycling, cycling, they're traveling at a certain rate of speed. If they're doing a very specific trick or whatever, and you want to freeze that, start at 1,000th of a second. Do the panning technique at a fast shutter speed. So that panning technique that I talked about, where I set my shutter, set shutter priority, continuous focus, continuous tracking, continuous shooting. But you start with a fast shutter speed and maybe perhaps increase it instead of decreasing it. Once again, only if your camera allows it to work that way. I know not all cameras do. The Nikons do, and that's why I like to use those. But
Yeah.
1,000th of a second is going to be a good starting point for that. You may want to see a little bit of movement in the back wheel, when it's spinning. So maybe just follow it and slow it down to a 500. I don't know. You want to freeze everything in midair, 2000 maybe, be a better choice.
I have an odd question, not odd, but like I guess kind of a different question other than sports. How a best way to counteract flickering lights? I'm guessing like I guess in gyms and stuff.
Uh, Flickering lights, are we talking about fluorescent lights that have a pulse?
I'm I'm guessing that she didn't quite specify,
Oh boy.
but if not, I mean,
Yeah, hard to say. Back in the day, we sometimes wanted to take a picture of a CRT screen, and
hmm
it has a refresh rate. The CRT screens had a refresh rate of a 30th of a second. So you set your camera to a 30th of a second or slower, and you would get the full screen without the black band. So in a case like that, what I would say is try different shutter speeds and see which one is going to work best for you for that particular lighting.
yeah, definitely. All right. So gosh, we're already pushing almost half hour past the hour. So I try to get to as many questions, but if you have further questions for Armando, definitely hit him up and he'll answer them. I did the best I could on this one. So, but thank you for gosh, lots of questions for you, Armando. So don't be surprised if they hit you up and start, blowing up your emails and stuff.
All right.
But definitely also thank you everybody and hope you have a great evening wherever you're tuning in from. And check us out next week for another Tamron Tech webinar. And other than that, have a great evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.